The full story of David and Goliath, told in detail, begins in ancient Israel during the reign of King Saul. The Israelites were once again at war with their longtime enemies, the Philistines. The two armies gathered for battle on opposite sides of a valley, Israel on one hill, and the Philistines on the other, with the valley of Elah between them. The Philistines had brought a secret weapon, a giant warrior named Goliath. Goliath was not only a giant in height, standing around 9 feet tall, but he was also heavily armed and covered in bronze armor. His spear alone was enormous, with an iron point weighing around 15 pounds. Each day for 40 days, Goliath stepped forward from the Philistine ranks and shouted a challenge to the Israelite army. He mocked them, calling for one man to face him in single combat. The outcome of this fight, Goliath declared, would determine the fate of the two nations. If the Israelite champion won, the Philistines would become their subjects, but if Goliath won, the Israelites would be enslaved. Goliath's presence and challenge terrified Saul and all the men of Israel. The Israelites saw Goliath as unbeatable, and no one dared to take up his challenge. Goliath's taunting wore them down, day after day, and the morale of the Israelite army began to falter. Meanwhile, a young shepherd named David lived in Bethlehem with his father, Jesse. David was the youngest of 8 brothers, and his 3 oldest brothers were part of Saul's army, camped near the battlefield. David was not old enough to be a soldier, but he had other responsibilities, tending to his father's sheep and occasionally delivering supplies to his brothers on the battlefield. One day, Jesse sent David to take food to his brothers and check on their well-being. When David arrived at the Israelite camp, he heard Goliath's challenge and witnessed the fear of the Israelites. But instead of fear, David felt something else, righteous indignation. He couldn't believe that no one in Israel, not even the king, was willing to defend the honor of their people and their God. David's faith in God filled him with confidence that Goliath could be defeated. David began asking the soldiers about Goliath, trying to understand why no one had taken up the giant's challenge. His inquiries eventually reached King Saul, who summoned David to speak with him. When David offered to fight Goliath himself, Saul was skeptical. David was just a boy, likely no older than his mid-teens, and he had no experience in war. Goliath, on the other hand, was a seasoned warrior, trained from youth. But David was undeterred. He told Saul that he had fought wild animals while protecting his father's sheep, lions and bears that had threatened the flock. And just as God had delivered him from those dangers, David was confident that God would deliver him from Goliath, the Philistine who had defied the armies of the living God. His faith was rooted not in his own strength but in his belief that the Lord was on his side. Moved by David's words, Saul agreed to let him fight. Saul offered David his own armor, but it was too large and cumbersome for the boy. David chose instead to go into battle as he was, armed only with his sling and 5 smooth stones that he picked up from a nearby stream. David placed his trust fully in God. David approached the battlefield, and when Goliath saw him, the giant was insulted. He mocked David, calling him a boy who had come to him with sticks, and cursed him by the names of his gods. "Come here," Goliath said, "and I will give your flesh to the birds and the wild animals." But David was fearless. He responded with one of the most famous declarations of faith in the Bible. "You come against me with sword and spear and javelin, but I come against you in the name of the Lord Almighty, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hands, and I'll strike you down and cut off your head. This very day I will give the carcasses of the Philistine army to the birds and the wild animals, and the whole world will know that there is a God in Israel. All those gathered here will know that it is not by sword or spear that the Lord saves, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give all of you into our hands." As Goliath moved closer to attack, David ran toward him. Reaching into his bag, David took out one of his stones and slung it with all his might. The stone flew through the air and struck Goliath in the forehead with such force that it sank into the giant's skull. Goliath staggered, then fell face first to the ground. Victory for Israel. The Philistines were stunned. Their great champion, Goliath, lay dead at the hands of a boy with a sling. David ran to Goliath's body, took the giant's own sword, and used it to cut off his head, sealing the victory. The Philistine army, seeing their hero dead, panicked and fled. The Israelites pursued them, driving them out of their territory. David's triumph over Goliath was not just a military victory but a spiritual one. It demonstrated that true strength comes from faith in God, not physical power. David, armed with only his trust in God, had defeated the greatest warrior of the Philistines. The story of David and Goliath marked a turning point in David's life. King Saul took notice of the young shepherd, and David became a prominent figure in Saul's court, eventually rising to become the king of Israel himself. David's victory over Goliath is remembered as a classic example of the underdog triumphing against overwhelming odds, and it symbolizes the power of faith and courage. Over time, the story has become a cultural metaphor for situations where a smaller, seemingly weaker opponent defeats a much stronger adversary, especially when driven by conviction or faith. David's trust in God and his courage in the face of fear have made him one of the most enduring and beloved figures in history.